Yeah.
Good evening. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Checks in the post. So yeah, firstly, let me get the right slide. Alrighty. So yeah, massive thank you to Craft, and in particular to Daisy for inviting me to come and speak today. So I'm actually based in Leeds, but I was born and I grew up right here in Manchester, so it's particularly special to be here this evening. So hello. So my name's Dan Forster. I'm an independent lettering artist and type designer. And this evening, I'm going to tell you all about my slightly nerdy world of type and letters. So what exactly is it that I do? Well, I've been lucky to partner and collaborate with brands and agencies from all around the world, working on all manner of type and lettering-based projects. And I work in sort of three areas in particular. So firstly, creating custom brand marks. So this can be word marks, logo types, symbols of all different shapes and sizes and styles. And in almost all cases, these are drawn from scratch. It's also been really nice to work directly with some agencies recently on their own rebrands. And yeah, it does seem like everyone's been rebranding lately, doesn't it? So yes, these are some custom brand marks I made for these guys. The second area that I work in is typefaces and fonts. So this can range from simple single weight fonts through to full families. Of course, it's really nice for me to be able to see brands recognizing and investing in the value of custom. However, I also understand that there isn't always the budget to build or code a fully functioning font. And in such cases like this one, there's always the option to create what I call letter sets or word sets. So this is often comprised of multiple product names, which are all styled consistently, as you'd expect with a font, but they're supplied as vector files as opposed to font files. And the third area that I work in is what I call illustrative and decorative lettering. So this can range from the relatively simple through to wildly flamboyant and decorative pieces, and everything in between. So this tends to be more free and expressive and detailed than the logo or the font work. And I also do some 3D lettering as well. So brand marks, fonts, lettering, these are the three main areas that I work in. Or, put it simply, like my mum says, so just to give you the full picture, I've got a little show reel. Little shout out to Steve Townsend for the edit on that. Okay, so just in case anybody might be wondering, no, I don't use AI to create my work. I never have, and I fully intend to keep it that way. I do what I do because I love it. I love the process of making the work, and that is really what it's all about for me. And that's just something that I don't ever want to let go of. So everything I do, it's original, it's custom drawn, and yeah, it's 100% me. So my talk today is titled Shaping Letters, and ultimately it's about the craft and the craftsmanship behind the work, which you might have guessed is something that's really important to me. But it's also about the interplay between shape and meaning and communication. And it all really starts with something that's always fascinated me about the lettering arts. And that is that we've got these predefined set of shapes to work with, and we're stuck with these shapes. And I've always liked to think of them as the lettering artist's blank canvas. It's sort of like a starting point or an empty vessel that is kind of awaiting something more. Because, of course, through dressing them up in different ways, we can use type as a means of expression and communication to stir mood and emotion, to evoke a sense of place and time, appeal to our senses, and just so much more. And for me, this is what can elevate type from merely style or aesthetics through to becoming a powerful tool for communication, to help to tell stories and to convey ideas. But before we get into all of that, just a little bit of background. So, as I've said already, I love my work, but I've not always been a lettering artist. I actually spent the first 15 years of my career working in graphic design. But looking back now, I'm actually really thankful for having the experience of being on the agency's side of the table, because it helps me to understand the wider scope of the type and the lettering work that I do today. So why the switch, and how did I get into type? Well, it turns out there's a whole story behind this as well, and unfortunately we don't have too much time today, but in a nutshell, the first thing you really need to know is that my dad was also a lettering artist. And as soon as I say that, I know it's easy to think that, oh, this is a father-like-son story. But it's actually not quite as straightforward as that. So this is my dad, Tony Forster, doing his best Mad Men impression here. But it wasn't actually until he passed away in 2008 that I got into lettering. But what started it all was a task that I was faced with, which was clearing out his studio. So looking at this picture, you can probably guess that it wasn't a quick task. It actually took about 8 years to get it all tidied up and organized. But what I found in there just absolutely blew my mind. There was just so much incredible work, and it was discovering this that literally inspired me to pick up a pen and start trying at least to draw letters. And honestly, once I started, I just couldn't stop. And it was soon after this that I knew that this is absolutely what I wanted to do. So that's kind of how it all started for me. Of course, it definitely wasn't an overnight change. So this is some of my really early lettering work. And it does make me cringe a bit showing this. But the truth is, when I was first starting, I really struggled. And I just had so many questions. And I was kind of kicking myself for not having picked my dad's brain when I had the chance. But I was determined to figure this out. So firstly, I just want to give you a little bit of insight into something that really sort of fast-tracked my learning and helped me to improve. And this is something which, in my opinion, is probably the single best thing you can do to learn about type and lettering. So it really helped me early on, but it was also something that I found actually quite hard. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about learning calligraphy, but also this concept called pen influence. So what's that? Well, pen influence is basically just having an understanding of how different pens make different marks. And I'm still not a great calligrapher, but the whole point for me was not really to learn calligraphy, it was to learn from calligraphy. So just one important distinction to highlight at this point is between calligraphy and lettering. So calligraphy is writing, so that's like one shot, one take, it's written off in one go. Lettering is drawing, so you can make as many iterations as you like. But I like to think as lettering as kind of a simulation of calligraphy, but with the freedom to take it to other places. So yeah, learning about calligraphy and pen influence, these proved to be absolute revelations. And just to give you an example of how it actually helped my lettering work. So if we imagine starting with a skeleton of a letter A, and then if we imagine a pen type, so in this case a broad nib pen, and then if we imagine holding it at a fixed angle, and if we plot the path of the pen over the skeleton, it sort of provides this free kind of guide as to where the weight should go. And it sort of seems a bit obvious pointing this out now, but when I first discovered this, it was like I'd found some sort of secret sauce. But what it led to was producing much more convincing lettering work. So you can see this is drawn, it's not written, but it's got that calligraphic feel about it. And I think this is a good example of how lettering can be a simulation of calligraphy. Taking that simulation to its extreme, so again, this looks like calligraphy, but it's actually not, it's a drawing. It's just been drawn super carefully and at a large scale and with ragged edges. So using this technique, it gives us much more control than what you get through calligraphy alone. But of course, it requires quite intimate knowledge of the pen, and then also what happens when pen meets paper. This is another simulation, but this is based on a different kind of pen. So this is a pointed pen. So the technique with this is you apply pressure on the downstrokes, and the nib splits, and you get a thicker stroke, and then you release the pressure on the upstrokes, and you get a finer stroke. But again, this is a simulation of that technique, and it's also hand-drawn. This is the refined sketch, which was later drawn on the iPad. So it's still a sketch. It's not vector. It's just been drawn at a higher resolution. I also spent a lot of time learning to write Roman capitals. And these shapes, these are like 2,000 years old. And these are literally the basis for all the type and letters that we use today. And you could argue that this was actually the first time in history that letters were given a style. Trust the Romans. But it was partly a result of the method that was used. So the Romans used a wide brush, but a broad nib pen is essentially the same thing. So this time, instead of using a fixed angle, the pen is actually rotated as the stroke is made. And this results in this very kind of specific shape for the serif. So this is a Roman letter E construction with a pen, which is written in 5 strokes. But now, when I come to draw the letters, I actually follow the same construction method because I find that it helps to retain the character and the DNA of the pen. So this same method applies any time that I draw Roman or inscriptional type. And this was used again here for a rebrand project for Apothic Wines that I worked on with Design Bridge in New York. So they wanted this classical feel for the type. We also made a monogram to go with it, and it turned out pretty nice. So once you understand the dynamics of the pen, literally the world is your oyster. And it opens the door to pretty much any style that you can imagine. So, and yes, this even goes for plain old, boring old sans serifs. You know, it's all derived from the pen and from writing. So now, before I start any kind of type project, I think about the pen. Could there be a specific kind of pen that I'm trying to emulate? Okay, so now we've got the basics down, we can start to have some fun with expression. So we've all seen examples like this of how type can communicate ideas visually. But I think there's also another way to be expressive with type, and it's something that really interests me personally. And again, it's about visual expression, it's about communication, but this time it's more to do with the form of the type and how we shape the letters themselves. So for example, maybe you're sending a message to a friend, but sometimes a bit of plain old text, it just doesn't quite have the desired effect. Sometimes you just need a little bit more clout. So I'm always curious about what we can do with the form of the type in order to tap into the senses or to provoke emotion. And something that I discovered really on was about how speed can play a role with lettering. So when you use straighter lines and sharper transitions, it tends to create this sense of speed or urgency. Conversely, if we want to slow things down and be calmer, we can open up the shapes and make them more rounded because it takes more time for a pen to travel around a circular shape. So speed is one aspect, but I wondered, can we take other things from the physics of the real world and apply it to type? So I remember this book that I had when I was a teenager and I was at college. I was doing lots of life drawing. And one thing I always remembered was it talked about gravity. So the subject on the left, she's been drawn sat in the chair, and then the subject on the right, she's obviously been drawn lying down in the chair. But if we reorientate the image, it really highlights this effect of gravity and what it does to the body. And at some point I thought to myself, I wonder if we could take this idea of physics and apply it to type. So I did a bit of experimenting. So this is the first iteration sketch from my own logotype. And so just looking at this A here, there's nothing particularly wrong with it, but I did wonder what else might be possible. So I made another one, which was this. So that was before, and that was after. And all I've really done is to move the weight down on the bowl and then lift it up on the stem. And for me, it just makes the letter feel much more kind of seated and relaxed, and overall just a much more interesting shape, in my opinion. So I started to experiment a little bit further. So I was just playing around with weight placement, just for fun, really, just to see what might work, what doesn't work. This guy's definitely having a bad day. So, I was just curious about introducing human characteristics into type. Movement. So with this, the idea was to try and make the whole thing feel like it's dancing and create this sense of rhythm and movement. But again, just thinking about the physics of the thing, it kind of makes sense that if this is the direction of travel of the strokes, then the weight is going to get thrown into these areas, because as it hits the bends, it slows down, and it's going to start to accumulate in these places. So it was this sort of thinking that informed some of the weight placement decisions on this particular piece. Travel is something else that just never fails to inspire me. I've always been interested in trying to convey the sense or the feeling of the place just through using type and letters. So in Jaipur, in India, there was this sort of combination of smog and heat, which created this kind of permanent shimmering haze that was like hanging on the horizon. And this is not the best picture, but you get the idea. So there's this elegance, but at the same time, there's also this disturbance happening. This was the piece that I made on a trip to Vietnam, which was inspired by some of the architecture in Hanoi. So, for instance, these double-line crossbars that run through the middle, they were inspired by this interior detailing that I kept spotting around the old town. And then the tail on the A was inspired by the shape of a temple roof. So how do some of these approaches and examples look in a commercial setting? So firstly, just two examples of how type can be kind of a vessel for an idea. So with Asda's Tickle Pink charity, we were able to work the breast cancer ribbon into the P, and then we've got the spoon in the negative space for Hartley's 10 cal. So both add in this extra layer of communication. This was a project I worked on with Studio Minerva in London, and this is for a company called Cartography, who are a luxury chocolate brand. And the founders, they spend a lot of time searching the world for the cocoa beans, and they do this specifically in these regions which are both 20 degrees above and 20 degrees below the equator, because this is where the growing conditions are best. And they somehow wanted to try and tell this story on the packaging. So we went through all these explorations of custom word marks, trying to suggest this idea of the search through the use of flourishes. And after several rounds, this is where we landed. But in terms of the storytelling, if you imagine the baseline represents the equator, then the flourish sort of travels above and below and helps to convey this idea of exploration. But it was when it was applied to the packaging that it really came to life. So with the help of the map in the background, the logo, you can see it's sat right there on the equator line. So it's a nice example of using type to help to tell a brand story. So a couple of years ago, I got to collaborate with my good friends at Elmwood Design on what turned out to be a really fun project. So they'd been awarded this contract to reposition the Mars global gum brands, so Orbit Extra, Freedent, and Yida, under one sort of unified look and feel. So as part of this, my role was to create a custom display typeface. So there was various aspects to the brief. It had to be fresh and fun and distinctive and ownable and all the usual things, but it specifically had to appeal to a Gen Z audience. But really, from all the discussions that we had, the brief just came down to this. Just create some chewy letter forms. So I'm going to quickly whiz through some of the process. So, as with all projects, we started by looking at a bunch of type references, and then we went through what seemed like just like 1,000 rounds of design options. You're just trying to figure out what was the most chewy. So yeah, it was pretty challenging, but it was a great, fun project. So long story short, this is where the design ended up. And it was kind of getting there, but it just felt like there was just something missing. And the main feedback that I was getting was, dial up the chewiness. So I was like, totally scratching my head with this, because we'd been through so many rounds already, and I couldn't really change too much because it was pretty much signed off. And I was like laying in bed at night, and all I kept thinking about was this. I had this weird image of this chewing face in my head. And so I was like, made this mental note to myself, that's probably something I need to investigate. So this is me having lunch. And I know this is horrific images, I do apologize. But yeah, the face, it gets pulled and distorted and pushed out of shape, and actually you start to get some interesting like dimples and bulges going on. So I started playing around with some similar shapes within the type, so things like super deep ink traps, these bendy counter shapes, and just like really exaggerated internal sort of bizarre forms. And then we tested this out with the wider character set and some other words. And then this was the final result. So the font was actually named Chew La La, inspired by the rhythmic motion of chewing. So then later on, fleshed it out, we added some numbers and some caps. And the Elmwood guys did like a really amazing job of bringing it to life with color and animation and just some great photography. And then as it got rolled out, there's some really fun posters started to appear as well. So I think this is a great example of how we can bend and mold and shape letters in order to hit the right feeling or the vibe for a brand. So lastly, I'm going to talk about what for me is one of the most enjoyable aspects of what I do, and that's experimentation. And I'm also a big believer in pushing yourself to try new things. And I think making personal work is a great way to do both of these things. So when it comes to experimental type, I've always been curious about the boundaries between utility or legibility versus artistic expression, and where is that line drawn? And I've always really enjoyed creating alternative interpretations of familiar letter forms, just seeing how far things can get pushed before you sort of hit that boundary of legibility. And what I've actually discovered is, as long as you've got the swells in the right places, you can actually get away with quite a lot. So these are some designs that I created for the 36 Days of Type event in 2021. And I really pushed myself with these. And I also set myself some goals to experiment with things like light and dimension, so trying to imagine they're almost like 3D typographic sculptures that could exist in the real world. Creating unusual shapes and forms, so the G's made from a single stroke, and then the P's just built out of all these abstract decorative elements. Playing with textures, so things like sand dunes and, not sure what that is, maybe melting marble. But also just trying to do something interesting with what you might call the boring characters, like the I and the O. So for me, this was just like a really fun, experimental, personal project to work on. So a few years ago, I was planning to do this 36 Days of Type, but I was just too busy to take part. But I'd drawn this A, and I was kind of in two minds whether I should post it or not. I was thinking, is it a bit lame just to do the A and then not bother with the other 35 days? And also, it's just a sketch, and it's pretty rough around the edges. But in the end, I just thought, well, why not? And I just posted it anyway. I'm so glad that I did, because a few weeks later, I got this email. And at first, I was like, oh, yeah, Jessica Walsh. I know that name. I was like, oh shit, Jessica Walsh, Sagmeister and Walsh. And she basically said, hi, are you interested in a type commission? So, of course, I emailed straight back. I was like, yeah, absolutely. And she said, great, Sagmeister and Walsh are rebranding, or so they told me. And the identity is going to be based around lots of different ampersands. And then they said, we saw your A, and we love it. Please, can you make some ampersands that look like this? And they've got to be quirky and oddball, but still recognizable as ampersands. So this is my kind of ideal project, just experimenting. So I spent a few days drawing all these oddball ampersands, and then I sent them off. And I was expecting her to come back and say, yeah, we like options 7 and 12 and 32 or whatever. Instead, she just said, yeah, these are great, carry on. So I was like, what? How many do they want? So this actually happened twice. So in the end, I actually drew over 250 ampersands, which I know is like completely ridiculous, and I definitely don't do this on all projects. But I sent them off, and Jessica got back, and she was like, great, these are brilliant, we love them so much, thank you. And then it all went quiet, and I didn't hear anything, and I think it was about 2 months later, I spotted on Instagram, they announced that Stefan Sagmeister and Jessica Walsh, they had actually parted ways, and then Jessica had formed this new company called And Walsh. And lo and behold, my ampersands were all over it, which was pretty exciting. So if I hadn't have shared that A on this 36 Days of Type event, I just never would have got this project. So lastly, I had another similar scenario. I was blown away to be able to work with Apple on this custom logo for their iPad event. And I'm a little bit limited to what I can say about the project, but one thing I can say is that when they first briefed me on the project, they showed me a whole bunch of references of my own work. So, this is just things that they like, things they wanted me to try out. But every single one of those references, it was of my personal work. None of it was commercial work. So with these two projects, there's a couple of lessons here. Firstly, it pays to experiment and make personal work. And secondly, always, always, always share your work, because you just never know who's watching. Thanks for listening.